Yeah.
So what happened? How did they do interviews when the consulate shut down? Hello and welcome to another episode of Visa Vibes. I'm Emily Newman, the managing partner at Reddy Newman Brown PC, and with me is my partner Stephen Brown. Together we help businesses, professionals, families navigate the complex and ever-changing landscape of U.S. immigration law. What do we have for today?
Yeah, Emily, we're going to talk about something. I call it an overnight change, but back on February 10th, the U.S. Department of State just changes a program, the interview waiver program, Dropbox, as most people call it. Overnight, no warning, no official announcement still, and not all consulates have made the change. Some have, some haven't, and it's already causing a ton of issues. People are getting their interview waiver appointments blocked, having to go back, schedule an interview. They're being turned away. Now they're having to schedule interviews which are far out. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so we'll go a little bit over kind of the visa application process. Really since 2020, the consulates have kind of streamlined things a little bit to make it a little more efficient. Not every single person who is renewing a visa after they've already been issued a visa before had to be interviewed in person. They could drop off their passport and their supporting documents and then get the visa stamped in their passport without having to actually be interviewed by someone in person. So they've adjusted who qualifies for that going forward. So we're going to break all of that down, how it impacts people, and just how to prepare for it if you are in a situation where you're needing a visa renewal in order to travel. So let's get started. Starting with, what the heck is a visa? Why are we even talking about this? The visa, there's a lot of terminology in immigration that people interchange incorrectly. So the visa is actually the stamp in your passport. It's called a visa foil. That you, when you're coming into the country, you open up your passport to that stamp, you show it to the officer at the port of entry, and that tells them why you're here, that you've been vetted, that you are legally entering the country, and then that CBP officer will decide whether to let you in or not based on whatever you state during your inspection at the port of entry. There's different types of visas. There are some that we refer to as non-immigrant, meaning temporary. These are your typical work visas, a student visa, a business visa, visitor visa. They're all short-term, just meant for you to come into the U.S. for a specific short purpose and then exit at the end. The opposite side of that is immigrant visas. These are green cards. So people can actually receive a green card at a consulate or embassy outside the U.S. in either the family-based category or employment-based category. There's other categories as well, but those are the most common ones. So having that visa, you come into the country and you show your documents at the port of entry, they let you in. Once you're let into the country, that CBP officer is going to determine what status to let you in and what your immigration status is and how long you can stay in the country. How long you can stay is based on an I-94 document that you print out from online after you have entered. So it's multiple steps in the process, multiple agencies involved. Department of State issues the visa, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, through CBP, Customs Border Patrol, decides who to let in, when to let them in, and for how long. And all of this happens after, at least for employment-based immigration, a company has already filed an application with the Immigration Service, which is also under Department of Homeland Security. So lots of moving parts here, but the whole purpose of these visas are to help regulate the flow of foreign nationals in and out of the U.S., and it provides the consulates with a process to screen and vet people before they are allowed to travel into the U.S. So what do we have to do to get a visa? What are the steps?
It really depends on the type of visa, non-immigrant, immigrant, but let's kind of talk generally. For the most part, Emily, this is going to start with obtaining approval for a category from USCIS. Whether it's an H-1B, a O-1, a P visa, it'll be that for the non-immigrant side, and then I-130 or I-140 for immigrant visas, 526. Now some temporary visas don't require approval with USCIS. B visas, F1s, J1s. TNs, but for the most part, for the most common, they do. Once you have that document approval, you're going to go on, you're going to complete the documentation for the visa application with Department of State, whether it's the DS-160 for non-immigrant visas, which is the non-immigrant visa application. It's done through SEAC, which is the Consular Electronic Application Center. Or if you're applying for an immigrant visa, a green card, the immigrant visas through the DS-260. So that's going to be your first step. It's a pretty lengthy document, right? I mean, it goes through 5 years of employment, address history, social media, all that stuff. A lot of information. And, you talked about vetting. That's the basis, right? They're going to take all that, run it through their security checks. Department of State has a ton of security checks, more so than your standard employment verification security check. Once you do the application, you're going to pay the visa application fee. That amount's going to depend on the classification, where you're applying, all that. You're going to schedule an interview with the embassy or the consulate, depending. You're going to go for a biometrics, pictures, fingerprinting, and then you're going to go through the interview. And, people, especially on the non-immigrant side, get really stressed because it's quick. It is a 2 to 4 minute, maybe 5 minute at most inquiry about what are you doing here? How'd you get the job? What are you going in to do? Who's your employer? It's quick. And not a lot of room for error because there's a ton of power that these consular officers have. And you're going to go to the interview. You're going to bring the documents that you got to bring with you, depending on your category. And then it goes to decision time. If it's approved, they're going to give you the passport back in a couple days with the visa foil in it. They call it a refusal. I'm not going to concede that. Under the statute, they can put you into 221G, which is administrative processing. It is a refusal. For all intents and purposes, it is a refusal. You should mark that you've been refused before if you get a 221G. We have fought that case in court. Judges agree, disagree. I'm not conceding it. But they can deny your visa. One of the most common, Emily, 214B. The consulates love 214B. It's lack of ties to your home country. Maybe, that immigrant intent. Certain categories don't allow you to have the intention. Everybody is viewed as intending to be a lawful permanent resident, and you have to prove otherwise. And some categories allow the dual intent, HL specifically, but for the most part, you have to prove it. And if they don't think you qualify for the visa, or they don't think you have sufficient ties to your home country, they're going to give you a 214B. And when they refuse your visa, do you get a long explanation?
No, they give you no information. It just says denied under section 214B. Well, that could be, as you said, because you didn't prove your ties to your home country, because they didn't think that you are going to return to your home country. It could even be because they don't think this is the proper visa category for you. And they don't tell you which is which. They don't go into a long dissertation analyzing the facts you shared and why they've denied. It's very cursory, and your only recourse in most cases is to just apply again.
Yeah, and even when we talk about 212 denials, where they found that you're inadmissible for one of the many reasons, it's a checkbox, right, on a form with all the different codes, and they check it, and there's no, you're inadmissible because you did this. And one sentence would be great for a lot of people. But, for the most part, hopefully you get your approval, and now you're going to enter the U.S. You're going to apply for entry at the port of entry with Customs and Border Protection. They will then make their own decisions. They always have discretion. Just because you have an approved H-1B, just because you have an approved H-1B visa foil, the CBP could still deny you entry into the U.S. Now they're going to, let's say they let you in, you're going to get an I-94. That's going to govern your terms and conditions of your stay. So lengthy process.
Yeah, so just think about all the vetting that's involved. So when a company first files a work visa, for example, USCIS is going to be doing some vetting, looking into the background of the company, looking into the background of the employee that they want to sponsor. They approve it. Just because they approved it doesn't mean the consulate is going to approve the visa. So now you apply for the visa, you submit that DS-260, DS-160, enter all of your social media handles, more extreme vetting, you get fingerprinted there, and then hopefully the consulate approves and gives you the visa. And then you still have to get approved one more time when you're traveling into the U.S. and give your fingerprints again and give your photograph again. So these people have been vetted. So there's no concern there that people are just
and they'll
randomly getting visas and coming into the country.
and they'll hold it up. I mean, if there's any sort of blip, I mean, infamously, Iranian nationals have all sorts of issues with processing of their visa just because of our geopolitical ties with Iran and all that. So they're going to look deep into this. It's not a rubber stamp here.
Yeah. All right. So now to the real topic here is the interview waiver program. Now there's a couple of different things that come up when you're talking about an interview waiver. So there is a visa waiver program that is for a lot of countries that allow them to travel into the U.S. for purposes of business or pleasure, visitor visas, without going to the consulate and getting that visa stamped in your passport. They can come into the U.S. for up to 90 days based on reciprocity. So if American citizens can go to another country for up to 90 days to visit without getting a visa, we allow their citizens to come into the U.S. for up to 90 days without getting a visa. They're still vetted. They still have to go through this ESTA to get an approval. They still get vetted at the port of entry, but they don't go through the consulate. That is not what we're talking about here.
Correct.
So that's the visa waiver program. It waives the visa requirement, so you don't have to get that stamp in your passport. We're talking about the interview waiver program. This is for people who have already been vetted in all these processes we just talked about, and have been in the U.S., maybe extended their stay in the U.S. through USCIS, and now 3 years later they need to travel again, and that visa stamp that's in their passport has expired. Mm-hmm. In that situation, they need to renew the visa in order to be able to come back into the U.S., and because they're renewing, they were able to waive that interview requirement in certain circumstances because they've already been vetted multiple times through all these different agencies. So that is what we're talking about, is who gets through this interview waiver program, who gets to avoid going in person for an interview at the consulate. It's also commonly referred to as drop box because you're dropping off your documents in a box and then you get your passport back with the visa and everything's great. So the whole point of this, it's in the Foreign Affairs Manual. It allows consulates to choose kind of low risk applications to basically streamline the visa process because it's hard for them to interview everyone. They don't have enough slots. So back before COVID, the ability to use this interview waiver program was kind of limited because that was during Trump times. So you had to have your prior visa expired only within the last 12 months. So if you've been here and your prior visa expired more than 12 months ago, you have to be interviewed. But if it was less than 12 months and you were applying in the same exact category, the same visa type, I've been here on an H-1B, extended my H-1B, my prior visa stamp and my passport expired less than a year ago, I'm coming back on H-1B, so I'm going to get this interview waiver because I've already been interviewed. That was kind of what happened prior to COVID. And then COVID hit, consulates shut down.
Yeah.
So what happened? How did they do interviews when the consulates shut down?
Good question. We're still actually reeling a little bit from that. The processing times at the consulates for interviews just exploded because they were shut down for many, many months, sometimes up to a year before they started taking in some. So what did they do? They expanded the Dropbox eligibility. They went from 12 months to your visa expired within 48 months and no restrictions on categories. So if you had a previous visa issued and now you're applying for a renewed visa in any category, you're okay. So if you had a B visa, an F1 visa, you can now get your H1B. And that was great. Again, we've talked about these people have all been vetted. They've all gone through the security check. There's still security checks that happen with Dropbox. It's not, you can't be radicalized and then go get Dropbox. They're going to catch it. This just got rid of that really short interview that takes a lot of time from the officer to prepare, do the interview, and make the decision, having less people in the offices, especially during COVID. And so they opened this up. It helped with processing times. It increased, how fast they could do it, how many visas they could issue, especially in high volume places like India. And it helps facilitate international travel. You could kind of, visa interviews still delayed months at a time, but I could get a Dropbox appointment next week. Now, if I've got to take that business trip, I can take it. And they also kind of expanded where you could apply. They allowed more third country nationals to do this. So if you are an Australian national, you could go to Great Britain and do your Dropbox there. That way places that are less busy could help out.
Yeah, and when these people are doing Dropbox again, they are still being vetted. They're still being fingerprinted. They're still being photographed, and all of their documents are being looked through. And because fewer people have to be interviewed, it gives more resources to the kind of bigger security threat, so that the officers can spend more time vetting cases that really need to be vetted.
Yeah.
So it really was a much better use of government resources, and we've had that process continue over the last several years until last week with no announcement at all. We just started hearing rumors, people saying, well, I just went for my Dropbox to drop off all my documents. I waited in line for 2 hours in my home country, and they told me it was canceled.
Yeah, and
no explanation.
And to be honest, I started seeing those. I started seeing in WhatsApp, Telegram groups, people, U.S. travel documents, which is the official website to do all this, but it's not a .gov website. And so people are like, is this legitimate? Is this not? This changed? It's not changed everywhere. Some consulates have changed it. Some are still 48 months. There's still no announcement from Department of State why we've changed it at some locations, why others don't. And so February 10th, they've reversed these pandemic era, policies that were created under Trump. He started doing some of these expansions and all that. And really during Biden is where it really expanded. But again, with the vetting, and now we're back to it was pre-pandemic. It's the same visa. You have to be applying for the same visa category. And it's back to the 12-month expiration instead of the 48-month. Well, most people don't travel every 12 months. So it's not as widely used. Now more people have to go for interviews. It's going to cause a backlog. Not to mention, like you said, people had appointments canceled without any sort of notice. They just show up and, nope, you don't meet the criteria anymore.
Yeah, so I understand the consulates, the Department of State has the power to change their policy. But when you're going to do it, shouldn't it be going forward?
Yeah, I could have totally understand if they said, hey, starting February 15th, we are going to do this, and no, we're not going to accept any more Dropbox unless you meet these criteria. But if before February 15th you have an appointment, great. We're going to honor the appointment. No, they just, if you don't qualify now, who cares if you scheduled your appointment back in December? We're canceling it. And it's not, people had plans. I mean, I've talked to people, you've talked to people who I was planning to go. I was there for, business meeting, a family event, figured I could do a quick Dropbox, get it back, not miss much time from work. Now they're stuck. They got to, apply for an appointment time to take the DS-160, get an interview, and
yeah, and it's not like they opened up a bunch of interview slots.
No.
So these people are literally just having to wait until an interview becomes available, because we already had limited slots, but now we've practically quadrupled the number of people that have to be interviewed. So yeah, a lot of people ended up being stuck outside the U.S. and have no way to get back until those interviews open up. So besides the people that kind of were caught in the middle of this with no announcement and not really a forward looking change, what other impacts are there going to be on visa applicants?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see longer processing times. I mean, we're going to see there's a limited amount of time in a day, right, for these officers that are doing these interviews. They've got to schedule them. They've got to, vet it. Now do the interview and make a decision based off of that interview. And I think what we're going to see is, backlog. Even after the interview for an adjudication, we might see more 221G notices because we need extra time because we can't keep up with the volume. And so how do you do it? You can only approve or refuse a visa. You can't, put it in limbo. Technically.
Kind of.
So technically, under the INA, there's only two options, okay? And so they're going to, quote unquote, refuse it under 221G. Eventually, they'll make a final decision on that down the road, but it gives them more time. we're going to see work disruptions. I mean, people who are thinking, okay, I need to travel internationally. I've got a client today emailed saying we have a key resource going to meet with one of our international clients. Where are we at on this? And now is that resource not going to be able to go? He's a key resource, or are we going to have people stuck outside the U.S. waiting for appointments, waiting to get those adjudications? Whereas Dropbox, 1 to 3 weeks. This could be a multiple month process in some, and family members too. That travel. So this has a lot of impact on businesses, the individuals. Everybody serves a customer some way. The customers in the U.S. that they work with. I don't think it's efficient, and I don't know what cuts are going to happen with Department of State personnel-wise that might hurt this even more. So it's going to be really impactful, I think, moving forward, negatively.
Yeah. So what can people do to prepare, knowing this now? I would say, number one, limit your travel if you need to renew your visa. So if your visa stamp that's in your passport has already expired or is expiring, and you want to travel, really second guess that decision to travel, because it is not the time to be traveling if you need a new visa, because as this is a perfect example, the rug gets pulled out from under you.
Absolutely.
In the middle of the process. And if you're outside the U.S. when that happens, you're just stuck. There's no fixing it. You just have to wait until they get an appointment or whatever it is. And if, we move forward with travel bans or things like that, which have been talked about with the Trump's immigration platform. So now is not a good time to travel. But if you do need to travel, double check your eligibility for Dropbox. They do have it on that travel.gov website. If you already scheduled your Dropbox, you're supposed to log in and recheck it, and then it'll tell you. Otherwise, if you haven't yet submitted your DS-160 and scheduled your appointment, as you're going through that process, it asks the questions to determine whether you're eligible or not. And so if it determines that you need an in-person appointment, again, maybe not a good time to travel, because now you've got to try to get an appointment. Those are going to be hard to come by because, again, 4 times the number of people are going to be trying to get them. And then even if you do get an appointment and you go and your interview goes great, they might just say, well, we need to look into this further. 221G, you're stuck in administrative processing. And we've seen that go 8 months, 9 months, a year, with people being stuck outside the U.S. And then if you are going to go for a visa interview, make sure everything is good in your documentation. Make sure that, amendments were filed properly. If you needed an amendment, you have all of your pay is done properly. Your job duties align with what's in your petition. So all your I's need to be dotted, all your T's need to be crossed, so that there's no reason that they can claim that something was not done correctly, because it makes it very easy for them to deny a visa or just delay it.
Yeah, and Emily, I think on the employer side too, employers have to adapt as well. And you and I talk about this all the time, is how can they support their employees? And I think that you got to go hand in hand here. You have to, employers and their employees that are on visa programs have to be a team on this. And whether they're, talking to their counselor or their internal teams to make sure the documentation is right. Maybe an amendment wasn't needed under USCIS's regulations, but the Department of State doesn't always play by the same rules. And so maybe an amendment might be needed with Department of State. Work out traveling early and travel plans. I mean, we've talked to clients on developing these plans on what should we do to minimize impacts, and is everything good, right, with the petition, and is it as safe as it can be? It's never 100% safe to travel. I am never going to tell anybody it's 100% safe. I mean, we've seen clean cases get stuck abroad. We've seen, clean cases get stuck at CBP. Nothing's ever 100%, but as clean as it can be. And then companies need to plan ahead of time. What happens if? And so if somebody's going, hey, I've got to go for this. I'm going to go for visa stamping. I should be back in about a month. What if you get stuck at 221G and you're stuck in that admin processing for 8 months? Well, what's your work from remotely policy? How are we going to work through that? to make sure that individual, the business isn't interrupted and the individual can keep producing with the company to not miss key deadlines. And then, I think it's important for companies to stay up to date on these changes. I mean, again, this was something that there is still no announcement, and it is consulate to consulate. Each mission, so each country is the U.S. mission to India, the U.S. mission to Australia. Each mission is setting its own rules, and we've seen some that are still at the 48 months, some are at 12 months. And so what's the way this has been caught is people staying on top of it, and word of mouth has gotten this. So stay up to date as an employer.
All right, and speaking of staying up to date, one of the potential new policies that the Department of State was working on was this idea of stateside visa processing. So for people who already got their visa abroad, came into the U.S., have been in the U.S., maybe extended their stay here, and they do want to travel, they do need to renew the visa, they started a pilot program to allow those people to apply for the visa while they stayed in the U.S. They submit the DS-160, they mail their passport off to some processing unit in the United States. So they do Dropbox, but basically everything happens here before the person has set foot outside the country. They get their passport back, and then they can travel. Great idea, because it really, if you expand on that, you're limiting the number of consular officers you need, you're reducing the size of the State Department footprint across the globe, because you can process these in Washington, D.C., for example. And so a lot of people really liked the program. We've had the program 20-some years ago, before 9/11, so it's not anything new, but it was put to bed after 9/11, and so we just now are starting to bring it back. But is that still, now that it's a pilot, we talked about expanding it, are those plans still on the table?
I don't know. We saw this pilot program last year. Everybody said it was successful. Department of State said it was successful. Attorneys have said it's successful. The people that went through it said it was successful. We heard rumors late last year that, hey, we liked it. We're going to go full bore, do what we want to do here in 2025. We got to hire people. We got to come up with the procedures, but we're going to do this. This is happening. I don't know. What is, the Trump administration thinking on this? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think there's some positives to doing it in a centralized location versus every consular officer having their own discretion. It's more control, which is good and bad. But, from the Trump administration, I like that control, right? But is this something high up on their agenda? And I wrote on our notes, what's the impact of DOGE on this, right? We're cutting federal employees, that are superfluous. Is this a superfluous program? Or do we see this as, repurposing assets? A lot of the consulate employees that do these sometimes are foreign nationals that are contracted with Department of State sometimes. And so can we bring that back here, with people in the U.S.? And so I see a lot of efficiency, and if we're going towards that way, it allows more control in the U.S. You have the Secretary of State has more direct line of communication on policy. It doesn't have to get disseminated out. I still think there's a possibility, but we've also been talking about this program for 4 or 5 years now. It's coming back, so I'm kind of we'll see it as it comes kind of stance.
Yeah, so this is, again, a great example of just how quickly things can change in immigration during a Trump administration. We saw this during the prior Trump administration, and it was many, many times without any warning, without any public, notice or anything like that. And so it is very important to stay on top of that and keep in the know with what's going on. And with this rollback in Dropbox eligibility, we're going to see more people needing visa interviews, limited interview slots. It's going to take longer for people to get the visa. People could get stuck abroad in these 221G administrative processing. So consider limiting travel. If you have to travel, just plan early, plan ahead, double, triple check your eligibility for the program. Make sure all of your documents are ready to go, perfectly done. Plan for contingency in case you do get stuck abroad. What's the work situation going to be? How are you going to get back? So those are the things you can do, and just stay up to date and keep listening here at Visa Vibes.
Yeah, be sure to subscribe. Thank you.
Thanks.